Hello everyone, welcome back. So now that we've gone through the trouble of setting up a Node.js server blank template, we're actually going to use it for something, and we're going to talk about web APIs. We'll do our first example this week with a very straightforward little demo. We're going to write a P5.js sketch that's going to look up the weather forecast, and then we're going to use that in our sketch to draw something. That's going to give us an occasion to practice all the different concepts that relate to using web APIs and using the server that we just built to enable that. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, so the first thing we will do is we will remix our blank sketch. Now this time around, I'm going to use the RTA842 node blank that we just developed in the previous video. So let's remix this, and we are going to call this example RTA82 weather. Okay, an example program that queries the weather using a web API. All right. Okay. So this is the server we built last time, right? So we have our basic route here. And then in the sketch.js, we're doing a simple example. We're just relaying the content of a web page as data using load strings. Okay. So we'll come back to the sketch in a second. First, let's talk about web APIs, what that means, and what we can do with them. So a web API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a way to access a service or a company's data using HTTP, which is the protocol we normally use to load web pages, that our browser uses to load assets, images, and so forth. So we're going to be using URLs to search against these web databases. Now, there's a lot of web APIs out there. A lot of companies provide an access to their services or sometimes their data for programmers to use and develop apps. We're going to start with one API this week, and then we'll open this up next week about talking about where to find APIs and maybe work with a slightly more complicated one. But for this week's example, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to use a website called OpenWeatherMap. And what OpenWeatherMap does is it provides an API, right? An API to access the weather. I'm using this one because it's got a very good free plan. So back in the days when APIs first started, a lot of websites just gave all of their data away for free. But very quickly, they've realized that, this is worth monies. And nowadays, most services will have some kind of a free version, right? And then if you want more access, you're going to have to pay for it. Now, this free version is pretty decent with OpenWeather.com. We can use their API 60 times a minute, which is really good. And it gives us access to, quite a bit of interesting features. We can pull the current weather. We can get the forecast for up to 7 days. We're going to use that in today's example. We can even get weather maps, which are kind of cool, like satellite views of the weather information, air pollution, some other interesting things as well. So with most APIs, the first thing you're going to have to do before you can actually use them is you're going to have to sign up. They're going to want your information because they have, as you can see, different tiers, right, that you can subscribe for. So I've already signed up for this API, and I'm going to get something called an API key. Okay. All right, so I'm already signed in here. We can get API keys on OpenWeather under this tab here, API keys. So I've created a key here. So this is my key, the default. I'm blurred it out here is just some code of characters, but your key is basically your unique identifier for your account. And you're going to need that key whenever you access the web API. So think of it as kind of like your login information. So I'm going to come back to that when we are actually programming, accessing the web API in P5.js. So what does this web API allow us to do? Well, like we said, we can query current weather data, we can query the forecast, right? All kinds of different features. So let's take a look at the daily forecast. Now this says 16 days, but the free version, if you remember from the pricing tab, only goes up to 7 days. whatever, good enough. So every API is going to be slightly different. They're going to each have their own documentation. Think of it as like each API is like a different programming library, right? So they have their own way of doing things, their own structures, but they're going to follow sort of general, the same general concepts. Let's take a look at the documentation. Okay? So the way we access these web APIs is going to be by creating API calls through URLs. Okay? So here they're telling us if you want to get the weather data, right, you're going to have to open this URL here at api.openweathermap.org. And this is the full API data /2.5 and then /forecast /daily for the forecast. And then we have a question mark. If you remember from the previous video, this is how we add parameters to our URL. And then it's going to have a few variables we have to define. So there's a variable called Q, which is going to set the city we're interested in getting the weather for. What's this CNT variable? The count, right? So this is an optional one, right? So the only two required variables are Q for the city and app ID. So app ID is going to be our API key. So we're going to have to include this API key as part of the URL that we are creating. And we can add some optional parameters like the units. So here they're telling us by default, all of their temperatures are going to be in Kelvin units. If we want metric, Celsius, we have to specify that. Okay. So here's an example of an API call, right? Getting 3 days worth of forecast for London. And here we would have to insert our API key, but basically the API call is a URL. Okay, it's a URL that queries api.openweathermap.org and at this particular URL, and then it provides the search queries as parameters to that URL. So if we were to include this URL and paste it in the browser and insert our API key, we would get some data back. Okay? And the data that comes back in this particular API, right, there's two options. So the default is something called JSON, which is, so if we open it up here, this is, so they're giving us a sample. We see we don't need the API key. So JSON looks like this. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And that's the one we're going to prefer, especially since we're working in JavaScript, because it lends itself really nicely. If you'll recognize the syntax here from when we created objects on the fly last week. This is the same syntax. So a JSON file is basically defining a JavaScript object. In this case, it's kind of a complex object that's got nested objects within it, and with different parameters, but all of our data will be represented as a JavaScript object, as we'll see in a second. The alternative format for the same data is something called XML. We might talk a little bit more about XML next week, but XML is kind of a more generalized form of HTML. And it's a way of encoding structured data using tags. So here we can see there's these tags, and then inside the tags we have the actual content, the actual data, sometimes as content, sometimes as attributes on the tags. And there are objects in JavaScript you can create that will help you navigate the structure and find exactly the right tag you're interested in and extract the data from there. JSON is a little bit more straightforward in JavaScript because it's kind of maybe more natively integrated. So these are examples of API calls. Here's an example that's limiting the results to 3 days with the count parameter. So we can see in the data we're getting the name of the city, and then we're getting a list that contains timestamps and then temperatures. So these are the different days. And it even contains the weather forecast as a description and as a little icon here. And maybe we'll use that for this example. So we'll talk about how we can turn these icon codes into image files and then display those within our sketch. So this is the OpenWeatherMap API. And so now that we understand a little bit how the API calls are structured, we can then translate that back into JavaScript. So we're going to turn our attention to that next. Okay. So we saw that in this example we did previously, we now have the ability through our server, right, to open up entire URLs, right? So like this is in this example, we took a domain name and then we loaded this URL right over here, and we got the response back through an HTTP request. Then we passed the information back to our sketch. We could do the same thing with a web API. In fact, that's the whole point of doing this. It's not just that we can open some random HTML, but some more interesting data. Now, what we want to be able to pass over, right, is an entire URL that looks somewhat like this. So it's going to have the base URL for the API plus a bunch of parameters. In this query route that we created, we can only really conveniently pass the base name of the URL. If we try to start adding parameters to this, then we're going to create a strange URL here, so we can't really do that. So instead, what we're going to do is let's just make a new route here for the weather forecast. Okay, so we're going to create route to get the weather forecast. And a route, remember in Node.js, just means like we're creating a URL, right? We're adding a path to our URL that we're going to be able to program what gets returned when that URL is opened. So let's create a new route and let's call this weather. And then the function is the code that's going to run whenever somebody goes to our website and uses the weather path, right? Puts that into the URL, this code is going to run. And the reply object is the thing we're going to grab to sort of send a reply back to the website. Okay. So so we do it in steps here, right? Remember, with the reply, we can send some text. And then if we change the URL here to /weather, oops, I should close my parentheses here first, so my code actually runs. If we change our URL to /weather, now we can see we're getting this text back. Okay. So our job now is going to be to figure out, how to get this URL right into our JavaScript code. Right, we're going to put in the parameters in there, insert our API key, and then we're going to use the request library that we're using over here, right, to request the data from the OpenWeather server, and then we're going to take that data and pass it back here to whoever is calling. And in this case, it's going to be sketch.js. Okay. All right, so the first thing we'll do, kind of like we did over here, is we're going to add a parameter to this URL. Okay, so it'd be nice if we could say weather, for example, what city do we want to query? So maybe we'll get the weather from Toronto. So in a way, we're kind of creating our own mini little API, just a simplified version of it. So we want to ask for the weather for Toronto. So I'm going to create a city parameter and we're going to set it to Toronto. So here, if we want to get that parameter, we're going to get it from the rec object, or for request. The request object has a query object inside of it, and then that query object has a parameters. So if we set the variable city in the URL, this query object will have a city variable set to it. And we could check that it works here by just sending that as the reply. Okay. Let's fix the indentation. So now you can see over here, we're getting Toronto back, right? So whatever we put in the variable, we're just sending it back to see that it works. Great. And then much like we did over here, we're going to make sure the city is being defined, right? So we'll say if city. Like if it's undefined, we don't want to try to do anything with it. If it is in fact defined, we are then going to construct our search query URL. Okay. So let's go back to the API documentation and let's grab this because we're going to need that information to build our API call. Okay. So there's a few ways we could approach creating the URL. Okay. We could say, let's define it as a string. That would be one way of approaching it. Something like this. And then we would need to add the API key over here. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, and then we'd have to go inside here and also change the city, right? So I might go like that, add city, and then we would have to go in here and then add the API key, right? So this is one way we can do it, kind of like taking pieces of string and gluing them together with plus signs. But once you start to have a long URL, this is going to start to get a little unwieldy. If you add lots of variables to it, like if you, maybe we might end up adding the, for example, the format, where is it? What was it called? The units, right? For example, we might add this. So it's going to start to get unwieldy. So instead, I'm going to show you how to create URLs using the JavaScript URL object. That's going to make things a little bit easier to manage. So first, we're going to define a string that's going to be the base URL, right, for our API. So everything up to the question mark. Okay. And then we're going to create a URL object. So URL is a JavaScript object. It just exists. We don't have to import it or create it. And we're going to start with the API as the base. Okay. And just as we go along here, I'm going to use console.log to show the output. So if we output URL, let's open the console. So remember this logs here, this is the server console. It's different from our browser console. So when we're doing the server-side programming, we want to see the logs in here. And when we're doing the P5 programming and we log things, we want to open the browser console. So we have two different consoles happening now. And sometimes it can get a little confusing which one we're in. Now we're in the server console. So we can see those logs over here. So here we can see the URL object is being printed. And once we have a URL object, we can kind of take it apart a lot more easily. We have, this is the actual link. This is the host name, right? We have the path, and we can modify these things programmatically. For example, we can easily add some search parameters to this URL by saying URL.searchParams.append, and we're going to add a search parameter for Q, which if we go back to YQ, right? Remember, Q is the required where is it? Here. It's a required city name, right? It's the parameter called Q up here. This is just coming from the OpenWeatherMap API. There's a few other ways, by the way, we could use it. We could also put some kind of city ID. We could also put in the weather at specific coordinates, latitude, longitude coordinates if we wanted to. So, but now we're just going to use the city name. So this parameter would be our city variable. Okay. I'm going to put that there. And just to see what happens, we're going to log the href. Okay. Cool. So now we can see it appearing down here. So this is now the link that we're creating, right? We started with this API URL, and then we've added the Q parameter equal to Toronto. So this is a little easier to add this to this string than to keep using plus signs and kind of build the string out of smaller little string pieces. It's a little bit easier to work with. So the other thing that we're missing here to be able to make the API call is the API key. Now, this is the other main reason, other than working around the whole browser client security constraints, right? We would not be able to open api.openweathermap.org straight from our sketch. We can only open websites that have the same base URL as our sketch. Other than that, the other big advantage of setting up a Node.js server is that we can hide our API key inside these this environment variable file. Okay? So on the left here, we have this little like heart-shaped key next to .env. These are environment variables that are accessible to our server, okay, but that are hidden from anybody who can see your code on Glitch, okay, who's not a project member. So right now there's two variables defined here with no value, so I'm just going to delete them. And let's create one called API key. Okay? And then in here, I'm going to paste my API key. So if you wanted to do this example, you're going to need to provide your own. Excuse me, I'm going to paste the API key here. And then if I open this sketch, so now I have this environment variable called API key. Okay. If I open the sketch, let's say in, let's open an incognito tab. Okay. And we're going to grab, we're going to open the sketch at RTA842 weather. That's the one we're working on right now. So now I'm not logged in on Glitch. Okay? And if we try to view the source, right, try to edit it, the environment variables are hidden. Okay? So only the owner of the project, aka me or other people I choose to add to it when I, as project members, can see those. So this is really nice because otherwise we would be putting our API key, aka our API password, on just straight up on Glitch for anybody to come in, look at the code, and copy and paste your API key, and then start using the API as if they were you. Okay? So that could be annoying for it. Somebody might end up using up all of your number of calls per hour or per minute, for instance, or straight up maybe abuse the API and then get you banned from it by using your key. So this allows us to place any kind of like secure content that we want to have on the server side in a place where only us can see it, and people on the web, even though they have access to the rest of our source code, which we're happy to share, our API keys and other sensitive information is hidden in there. So this is very important. So now I was able to hide the API key inside this environment variable file. So having done this, then how do we access it? Well, it's straightforward. We're going to add here a parameter to the search. It's called app ID. I remember it from the documentation. And the way that we access these variables is through process.env all caps, env lower caps, and then my variable name. Okay? So anything we put inside this env file as a variable, we can access like this on our server. So now it's appeared, my API key has been added at the end there, and we could test that this URL is working before we go any further. So I'm going to just copy and paste this and then put it into the browser here, and we can see we're getting some JSON data back. Okay, so this is great. All right. So now that we know that this is working, what we could do is we could say, okay, we have the URL, right? Let's create a request instead of just logging it. We're going to use the request library, just like we did with this route over here. And let's define a function that's going to run when the data comes back. And when it does, we are simply going to say reply with the body of the data, which is the JSON data we just received by running this URL. Okay. And there it is. So now we have our JSON data. So whenever we call this URL with a city, right, what we get back is the data for the weather forecast. And there are two nice things about this. One is that this is now a URL we can use from within our sketch because it is on our app. I'm going to copy it while I'm here. It is on our domain, so we can use it. And our app ID, our password, has been hidden inside this environment variable file so that we don't have to share it with the world. We can just refer to it as a variable. So this is pretty sweet. So we're not really going to need this route anymore. So I'm just going to comment it out, but I'm going to leave it here for reference in case, maybe we want to use it for something else down the road. So for this example, we're just going to use this weather route that we created. So it kind of acts as a middleman with the OpenWeatherMap API, and it does specific search for the weather, where we provide a city and an app ID. And while we are here, let's also add a search parameter to set the units in metric. And that's going to be a string. Because I don't know about you, but the Kelvin degrees confuse me. So metric is a little bit easier to wrap our head around. Okay, so now that we've done this work on the server side, we can jump back into our sketch and then we can figure out how to use this data to do something within our P5.js sketch. Okay. All right. So this example here was there just for reference, right? But this is no longer meaningful because we just commented out the query route, but also this is the URL from the blank template. Okay, and now we are in a different sketch. So what we're going to do here instead is we are going to say this is now weather, right? This is our program we are writing, RTA842 weather.glitch.me, and the route we made in our server was called weather, and it takes a parameter called city with the city we're interested in. And now we get this. I'm going to remove this, so we go back to showing the index page, right, where our P5.js sketch lives. I'm going to close this console so I don't get confused, and I'm going to open, this time I'm going to open my browser console so we can see this log over here. And there's a lot of junk. Okay, so now we can see that in this array of strings, we are getting our data back. Okay. Now this is not a great format to load the data in because it is a JSON object, which means we don't want to load it as strings. We're going to load it as a JavaScript object. So let's do a couple of changes here. First, we're going to create a global variable called data. Okay. We're not going to make it local. I'm going to keep the load strings here. I'm going to cut that. And let's delete this. And rather than loading it in setup, we're going to load it in preload. Okay. All right. And instead of using load strings, we are going to use a function called load.json. So load.json is similar to load strings. It's going to open the URL, but instead of taking the output from that URL, loading it as strings, it's going to create an object from the JSON data for us, and it's going to put it into this variable. The reason we put it in preload is that there's always a little bit of a time gap, right, between the time when we issue the request and the time when the data actually comes in. So if we do it in setup and then try to do stuff with it right away in our code, the data may not be there in this object just yet. Okay. So preload makes sure that our stuff is properly loaded before we actually try to use it in setup. And I've made it a global variable so that we can take a look at it from the console's perspective. That's a great way to kind of play with your objects, right? Once you have an object, you can access it in the console, just so we can try to understand how this JSON object is structured. The only thing to remember, if you're going to try to access your variables in the console, you have to be a little careful. You have to make sure that this frame over here is selected, because you can see there's tons of different areas. We want to make sure, see it's getting highlighted in blue here. This is selected so that we have access to these variables. So now we'll be able to see I have a variable called data, and I can just hit enter and print it out. And we have, we can expand this, and then we can see how the object is being structured. Oh. And I just realized actually that I'm using the wrong API call. So instead of the forecast, this URL weather is giving us just 1 day worth of weather, but I kind of want to have the full forecast. So let's go and fix that real quick. So this is the URL that I intended to be using. I just got a little confused in my copy and paste. So let's go and fix that. So I jumped back into our server here. We're going to change the base URL of our search to be forecast/daily instead of weather. So if you just put weather here, it would just ask for today's weather, whereas here I'm more interested in getting the forecast as well. All right, back back to our sketch. It doesn't change our route, by the way, so our route is still just called weather because the route is just the name we chose to give this URL over here. So this we have control over. This is how the API, this particular API, is defined. Okay, so let's clear that and try again. Now that we've refreshed here. Okay, that's more what I was expecting to see. So now we have this object coming back. So we have, as part of data, right, we have city, and then city contains all this other information. We have an array called list, right? And we can see it's an array because of the square brackets. And then list has 7 elements because we can only get 7 days worth of forecast with the free account. And then inside each of these, we have the forecast for a given day. So we have the timestamp here. So this timestamp is in Unix format. It's in number of seconds since a specific day in the 1970s. We can see in a second how to convert this to a timestamp we can use in JavaScript if we want. And then we have all this weather information, like the different forecast. And then over here, we have the weather description, including this weather icon code. So we'll talk about how to use that in a second. So how do we access the data inside this object? Well, it works just like a regular JavaScript object. So we use the dot, so for example, if we wanted to say city.name, we would say data.city.name, or data.list, right, is our list. This is an array of the 7 days of the forecast, or data.list bracket 0 is the first day, right? And data.list bracket 0.weather is the sub array that contains this information. Okay? So we can navigate this object just the same way we would access the fields and properties of a regular JavaScript object. So in this case, let's go and grab all of these weather icon codes. Now, what are these? Well, if we go back to the documentation here, I'm going to do a bit of a search to find it because this is a big page. So we have icon over here. This is the weather icon ID. And what I'm looking for is this. Okay, so OpenWeatherMap has the different weather condition codes. And if we click on this link here, it's going to explain to us how to get an icon URL from a code. So for example, if our code was 10D for light rain, we could create this URL here, insert 10D in there, and that would give us a link to a PNG file that looks like this, right? It's got a transparent background with a little cloud and some raindrops. And you can get it small or bigger by saying like 1x, like 4x would make it bigger. 2x is twice as large as the default, and so forth. So this is how big it's rendering. There's probably a limit. I haven't tested it. Yeah, you cannot do 4x, 8x, so I guess it goes up to 4x here. So we can get these icon codes from our data over here. So if we could get those, we could write some code that will display the 7-day forecast as these little weather icon codes. Okay. So let's do that to wrap up this example. So first, I'm going to make an array here called icon images, and we're going to use this array to store the icons that we're going to load from OpenWeatherMap.com. So preload here, we're going to leave it as such. This is just loading our data. So in setup here, now that our data is loaded, we can now go through it and we can access individual elements of the data. So for example, we know that the forecast is in data.list. Okay, so we could say let's write a for loop that's going to go through, and I don't really need to put it in a separate variable here. I could write like this. It's just to make our code a little bit clearer. Let's iterate through this the forecast. And then let's extract the weather icons. Okay, so we're going to say the icon, right? If we go back to our data over here, we have a weather kind of property, right? So we have forecast bracket I dot weather. And then inside this, we can see this is actually an array. And at index 0, right, we have an element called icon. So I'm going to say bracket 0 dot icon. And let's log these so we see it's giving us something. Let's format the thing so it doesn't give us errors. Let's clear the console and refresh. Not forest. I don't know why I wrote that. Forecast. There we go. So now we can see our icon codes. So we have these icon codes, and I guess there's two consecutive ones here. They get marked with a 2 and a 2. So we're getting these icon codes. Okay? So from there, we could generate these URLs, for example, if we wanted to. I'm going to copy this. So this is the recipe to make the icon URL. We just have the icon code here that we got to replace. Okay, so let's insert it like so. And then we're going to log, just so we know that we're on the right track here, we're going to log these URLs. Okay? And all of these should be links to, if they work, let me open one. Yeah, they should be links to different weather conditions. Okay? Cool. So having done this, and instead of just logging it, why don't we go into icon images, bracket I, and we're going to load the image file represented by this URL. Now, in this case, because these are meant to be accessed remotely, there's no policy access restrictions on that file. So we don't have to go through our Node.js server to load it. We can just open it directly. So there'll be some exceptions to those policy access, but generally speaking, most files that have not specifically been made available, like basic URLs, we have to go through the server, with some exceptions, like last week's spreadsheets, or sometimes loading images such as these icons. Now, if you try to hotlink images from other sites, you may get into the access policy issues, depending on how their server was set up. And I think we might want to put an S here. Yeah. So HTTPS, the glitch insists on it because our site is using HTTPS as well. Okay. So now this should have loaded the 7 images from the forecast into this icon images array. So let's change our program here to display them. So we're going to write another for loop. And then in here, we can draw the images. Now, let's spread them out across the window. We're going to use map for that. Let's map the loop counter, which goes from iconimages.length 0 to iconimages.length -1. Let's have it go from, let's say, 100 to width -100. And then let's draw an image at x, height over 2, and icon images bracket I. Like so. And we should see our 7 forecast images. By default, remember, image is corner mode, so we're going to say image mode center, just so our layout looks correct. There we go. Yeah, so just a quick example here of how we could use the data coming back from OpenWeatherMap. So in this case, I'm going and grabbing the 7-day forecast, the list, and then inside the forecast, I'm reaching into the structure, grabbing the weather attribute, grabbing the icon parameter from there, and then using that to create a URL, loading all 7 images, and then displaying them into my sketch. But of course, we could do other things, right? If we look at the forecast, data coming back, right? We have timestamps, we have weather, wind, speed, and so forth. So you could use this information to do other things in your sketch. And that's going to be the code exercise for this week. So this example here showed the icons, but just to get a little bit of practice, because we've thrown a lot of new information this week between the server-side code, which you shouldn't have to necessarily tweak unless you want to try different different functions of the API, right? So going back to here, if you want to try different calls, this is the one we're using, the forecast. If you wanted to try, let's say, the weather maps, for example, there's a different API for that. So you might have to change the server-side code over here. But if you want to stay within the bounds of the forecast, for the code exercise, you'll have to first sign up, create an API key, make sure you can remix this example, update the API key to be your own. And then once you've done this, kind of play around with the data coming back over here, maybe do something with the temperature ranges, just create some kind of little visual that's going to use the weather forecast as the underlying data, just so that you can kind of make sure that you can go through the whole process from creating an account to getting some data back. And we'll explore a different API in next week's videos. So until then, take care, and I'll see you next week.